How many sets does one need in order to see progress? A video that I'll be reviewing for one of Fitness FAQ's videos, aka Daniel Vadnal, and a special guest Simon Stur touch upon a very important principle that could seriously impact your training. So let me stop yapping and let's get right into this video.
With calisthenics, there's such a mismatch between what we actually do and what the science says. We know elite athletes that are doing literally hundreds of sets a week for an exercise targeting a muscle, when the science says on average 10 to 20 sets is going to be great for most people as a basis. What's with the discrepancy between calisthenics versus...
Okay, so my guy Daniel is getting right into the video by refuting what these science-based claims are saying. And this is specific to the correlation to what amount of training volume you need in order to see strength progress. So I did some digging in regards to like what studies are out there, and here's what I found. According to researchgate.net, titled A Systematic Review of the Effect of Different Resistance Training Volume on Muscle Hypertrophy, the main objective is to find the notion of whether or not high volume training results in greater increases in muscle size, compared to that with groups with lower volume resistance training. Now, they are keeping the training duration, exercises, and intensity the same. And I do want to note that this article is specific for building muscle and not taking into account specific for strength training. So that is an important note. But the reason why I'm bringing this article is because there are some correlations between what the article says specific to muscle building and also how that can translate over to strength training. But let me dig a little bit deeper to what the article says. Now, taking that into account, they allocated these three scenarios. How many sets should one train per session? How many sets should one train per week? And finally, should one consider their current training volume to decide whether or not to increase or decrease the amount of training volume moving forward? This led to the conclusion that out of the three groups who were put into the categories of low volume, which equates to less than 12 weekly sets, medium volume, which equates to 12 to 20 weekly sets, and high volume, which equates to greater than 20 weekly sets, indicates that there was no significant difference between the moderate and high training volume categories. Thus, the recommended range for 12 to 20 sets weekly was deemed to be the standardized number for weekly volume needed per muscle group, which I must clarify again that this test was specific for building muscle. But I do want to mention that this study is consistent with the way most people approach their calisthenics strength training. And also, I would say strength training in general when it comes to weightlifting as well. However, based on my personal experience with the last 6 years of doing hybrid-based training and understanding the complexities needed to program a workout with calisthenics and weightlifting, there's a spectrum of weekly volume needed in terms of the complexity of the exercise that you're going to be performing and how many sets you're going to be allocating towards that particular exercise or muscle group. And for the most part, some calisthenic exercises tend to lean more so on the higher end of the weekly volume spectrum, specific to their skill training. This is all to improve just the overall strength adaptations. And y'all, I know y'all heard me say this plenty of times, practice makes perfect when you're trying to learn a particular movement, right? So a skill movement, this could be anything as simple as learning the basic pull-ups or anything as difficult as doing like the planche push-ups, right? You need more volume to some degree. And of course, while you're managing your intensities, which led me to another study published by the National Library of Medicine within their database. And their whole objective was to conduct a meta-analysis and examine the potential effects of low, medium, or high weekly set strength training on muscular strength per exercise. Additionally, they also had the objective to examine the strength gain variations when performing compound or isolation-based exercises. And in conclusion, they found that medium or high weekly sets strength training is marginally more effective in producing strength gains compared to that than low weekly set strength training. Then we got another study that speaks about the effects of training single sets versus multiple sets, with the conclusion that the difference between 2 to 3 sets and 4 to 6 sets was smaller than the difference between 1 set and 2 to 3 sets, showing that anything above 2 to 3 sets tends to level off, or I would say there's diminishing returns as far as the strength gains that you would get, perhaps because of just overaccumulation of fatigue, and that leads to junk volume and just not being able to recover and perform optimally. So this is specific to 2 to 3 sets per training session, which pretty much led to this final statement and conclusive approach. And I quote, individuals interested in achieving maximal hypertrophy should do a minimum of 2 to 3 sets per exercise. It is possible that 4 to 6 sets could give an even greater response, but the small number of studies incorporating volumes of greater than 4 sets limits the statistical power and the ability to perform any definitive conclusions. If time is a limiting factor, then single sets can produce hypertrophy, but improvements may not be optimal. Hence why it is possible to make gains with just 1 set, but it would be better to do 2 to 3 sets. And if you do anything more than that, then there's going to be like diminishing returns, depending on the exercise, of course. Now, I know I yapped through a whole bunch of scientific articles and studies, which I never do on this particular page, but I kind of wanted to provide some context to what Daniel was saying in regards to why there's such, conflicting interests in research studies and why we shouldn't take everything that the study says specific to our calisthenics strength training. And now with this context, I'm going to now go and watch the rest of this video with you guys.
Limit of volume. So you do have some studies showing that more volume tends to be better. You reach a point where more volume tends to give diminishing returns. And then at a certain point, we kind of see it's detrimental, like you're training too much. But you have a lot of studies that are showing more training is better, and more volume tends to just yield superior results. And then you get variation within those studies as well. So it's not like every individual, like on average, more volume is better, but you get some people who respond better to low volume, some people who respond better to high volume. On average, the best athletes train higher than train with higher volumes than the research would recommend. So they're just doing a lot more work. I think the skill component of calisthenics comes into that. So you have higher volumes would yield better effects with calisthenics, just because you're training more frequently and there's a higher neurological component to a lot of the exercises. There's a lot more of a skill component. So like a handstand push-up is going to take longer to master than a squat. And a lot of the exercises that are studied in the literature tend to be more stable, easier exercises like a squat.
So as you can clearly see, Simon here mentions the differences of opinions of what these research articles say. And with the context that I provided earlier, hopefully y'all can appreciate why I shown those articles, right? There's different articles saying different things. And it's not because what they're saying or what he's saying is contradictory. It's rather because they apply and they vary depending on individual needs and the way they approach the training, how they recover, how well they respond to those amount of volumes. There's just too many variabilities that you can't be dogmatic with one specific approach. That's why there's a big spectrum, a range of like how many sets per week that one should do, right? And this big range leaves too much room for interpretation. So this is where people who are more dogmatic kind of be like, oh, based on my experience, this makes the most sense. But we got to take into account that we can't just go based off relative experience. We got to go based off like objective, right? We got to speak objectively. Now, I do like the fact that he mentions most of these studies don't take into account calisthenics specific skills or exercises, such as how one would need to learn the handstand push-up will ultimately need more weekly volume, as I mentioned earlier, with skill training. This is just to improve strength adaptations compared to that of learning a squat or bench press, which is less technical in exercise nature. So what does that look like in a practical sense? Well, the way that I approach learning any difficult calisthenic exercise, because of a lack in strength or technical understanding to some degree, more sets is more productive, taking into account that you're not training to failure or with high intensities each and every set or each and every training session, meaning you want to build your way up to doing more sets and by reducing the number of repetitions. One method that I currently use for the purpose of increasing my handstand push-up numbers is having one session where I start off with just 3 sets of 3 reps. And the reason why I chose 3 reps is because I know I can do 3 reps on handstand push-ups on command without it being too much effort, meaning it's not high RPEs. And the reason why I chose 3 sets is because this is the recommended minimum number of sets per exercise required to improve strength adaptations. So once I'm able to do 3 sets of 3 reps with the handstand push-ups, right, then the next stage for me is to increase that number of sets by 1. So now I'll be doing 4 sets of 3 reps. And all this is doing is just progressively overloading the exercise with just the number of sets on a very small scale. And then once I get to that point, I mastered 4x3. I then do 5x3, 5 sets of 3 reps. And then after that, I revert back to doing 3 sets again, but this time I'm increasing the number of repetitions because I've established the work capacity to do more work, right? So now I'm doing 3 sets of 4 reps, and I pretty much rinse and repeat this process until I can do 5 sets of 5 reps. And you can take this all the way up until like doing even more sets, right? Or adjusting the number of repetitions based on what you can just do right off the bat. So if you can't do really much handstand push-ups, then maybe you need to do something like 5 sets of singles and then work your way up there, right? So it really depends. Everything really varies on the individual. That's why there's a range of rep ranges and sets that most people kind of recommend that can apply to a wide pool of people.
There's a point of diminishing returns for this quote unquote junk volume. What does that actually look like, and how can we tell when we're getting into that territory of junk volume?
So junk volume is just adding more sets without getting a benefit to it. It's very hard to know when you're getting into this kind of realm of junk volume. But what I tend to find is if you're doing high quality practice, if you're getting stronger, I wouldn't change anything. The way I like to think of it is volume will influence the magnitude of changes that you get. So you do 1 set a week, you get some changes. You do 2 sets of that a week, you get more changes. You do 3 sets of that, you get more changes. And at a certain point it plateaus, and then it might even hinder progress thereafter.
So this demonstration by Simon really hits home with how one should focus on how many total sets one should do per week, but rather look at how you're training. Take an honest approach to your training and see if you're making results. How much effort are you putting? If you're making results with your program, then don't change the number of volume, right? Rather, increase the intensity. Or if you are making results and you feel like you can handle more volume and you haven't really necessarily felt like you're beating yourself up in terms of not recovering properly from session to session, then play around with increasing the volume slowly, right? Don't max out your volume stats, like ease into it, right? Now, if you're not making results and you might be either doing too little volume or too much volume, then you want to kind of either increase the volume slowly if you're doing too little, or decrease the volume if you're doing too much. And this is all going based off the recommendations for what he mentioned. So that's his recommendations, 10 to 30 sets per week. The studies that I showed anywhere between like 12 to 20 sets. So y'all pick and choose which recommendations y'all want to follow. It doesn't really matter.
You're not really trying to hit this perfect optimal zone. You know, you're not trying to hit that peak. You're just trying to hit somewhere that's effective, somewhere that's going to give you progress.
Now, to add to practicality, I actually agree with Simon's comment. For example, I currently allocate a range of 20 to 25 sets for my entire upper body pressing based movements per week. If you think about it, it's not a whole lot of volume if we're taking into account it's for my chest, shoulders, and tricep volume per week. And the fact that I purposely allocate more volume for certain movements and muscle groups so it's not evenly distributed, yet every training block I still see results, whether it's PRs on my weighted calisthenic movements or my skill-based movements. And that's simply because I don't focus on adjusting volume when it comes to progressive overload, but rather I focus more so on intensities when it comes to training for strength. And this is just going based off my experience. So it doesn't take me too many sets per muscle group to see progress, but this is because when I assess my training intensities, it's fairly accurate. I track it down. I literally write it down on my phone. So had my intensities been misrepresented, either I'm not tracking it accurately or I'm not even performing high or low, giving the training intensity for the week. With the combination of low volume, I will for sure not see results that I'm seeing now. And that's the thing about training, man. There's many routes to take. It's all about just what makes the most sense per your goals, what exercises you're doing, and just how well you respond to it. Literally, some people respond better to low volume. Some people respond better to higher volume. Some people can have the tenacity to just do low volume, high intensity. Some people got the tenacity to do higher volume and moderate intensity. You get what I'm trying to say? It just depends on the individual and just their whole, I guess, characteristics of like how they want to go about training, which actually leads on to the final point of this video, where Daniel just speaks about his personal experience with him focusing on training with high intensities and not worrying too much about adjusting volume.
Especially with volume as it relates to just purely sets, keeping that relatively constant is a great way of simplification and keeping yourself accountable. Because I find a temptation that I have, just say I'm trying to progress over 8 weeks, adding more sets towards the end has an influence on my intensity, and it's hard to understand and know if I'm actually progressing. And I find that by adding more sets, my intensity across the board tends to diminish because, oh no, now I've got to do 5 sets instead of 3. And it just is like a get out of jail card for actually doing the work. So I find that most people as well, if they can just not have any wiggle room with the set and just try a phase where you're just increasing pure intensity, the progression, the weight used within the rep range or hold time that you've given to yourself, the linear progress that you'll make will be so much easier to see and understand. And you'll have more sessions where you're like, I'm going to improve on my previous effort, as opposed to doing a 4th set, but then I have to drop the whole time or the reps, and it's like it gets very complicated extending it out as it relates to volume.
And that right there, guys, is the philosophy that aligns the most with me. Focusing with training with the right intensities and managing the intensities optimally while keeping everything constant, meaning the sets and reps per week. It makes tracking progress literally much more visible to see. There's less variables that you got to worry about. Are you really worrying about is just putting in effort? It's honest work, really. Are you training hard or are you training easy, right? Now, I do want to point out, and Simon and Daniel mentioned that this is most specific to the basic calisthenic movements, whether you're doing like the pull-ups, dips, push-ups, etc., or witty calisthenics, right? This is where the approach makes the most sense to just focus on mainly incorporating intensity as the main variable for progressive overload and keeping everything constant, like the reps and sets. Whereas when it comes to training for skills or learning new movement, that's kind of where things become a little more complex, right? You got to start adjusting different scenarios, such as the volume, the intensity, and the progressions, right? Which pretty much just goes back to what I was talking to you about with my progression method for my skill training for handstand push-ups, the 3x3, working your way to the 5x5, right? That's what works with me. But hey, what do I know? If you want to see more content like this, be sure to follow me, man. I'm the Tough Fitness Guy out here. No cap.
Cobra Trains, he's up next. Make sure y'all subscribe to him. He's number 1 out here.
He's the toughest fitness guy out here.